Hello guys, today I'm going to be telling you the basics of photography and using your camera specifically. This will be a two-part video. The first part will be this, where I will be explaining the multiple different hardware options and settings you can use on your camera. The second part will be using this SX540 from Canon, which is a bridge camera for £349, and comparing it to my EOS M50, which you are being seen through right now. And I will be comparing the different features and also the actual photo quality you get from either camera using similar shots. Now, this will be a two-part video. The first part, if you are getting into photography, watch this video first. If you have a camera, getting used to the hardware, I'll be telling you all about the hardware of using a camera in this video. And in the second video, I'll be explaining the differences between my EOS M50 and this one, and then also doing some photo shoots offs. So yeah, hope you enjoy. Now, this is my Canon EOS M50. I will be explaining the actual hardware that you will be using and the settings you will be changing in your daily lives as photographers in this video. And then in the second part, I will be explaining the differences between what I would consider a mid to high range camera, which is this camera, and a low range camera, which is that camera that I'm using to film right now, which is the SX540. Now, this is supposed to show you the actual camera quality of this video, because I will be swapping back to this as soon as possible, because setting that up is absolutely horrible. There is no rotatable screen. So yeah. Now, getting into this, I will be going off with the first bit. Now, this is a lens. A lens is probably the most useful part of your camera, apart from the body. This is the body. This is what we call the body. When you buy a camera, you'll often see certain cells saying body only. This is the specific body only of the M50. This is the lens plus body. Now, a lens is a physical piece of lots and lots of layers of glass, an aperture ring, and a little hole at the bottom. Now, if you were to look through that, the hole at the bottom is actually really, really different. It's really small for what you expect from a camera, and that is the aperture hole, which I will explain a little bit later. Now, this is the zoom ring. This is the focus ring. Your camera will be slightly different for what this is. Sometimes your lens has no zoom ring at all. It's a fixed lens. Sometimes it has no focus ring at all. It's an automatic focus only ring. This is a f22mm f2 stim lens. This is a 15 to 45mm f3.5 lens. Now, if you see clearly there, you will know there is quite a bit of writing on it. This is key writing that you will have to get used to knowing and looking at for your lens. This gives you most of the information about your lens, and it says Canon zoom lens, so it's telling you it's a zoom lens. It has no detachable fixed zoom. It's a zoom lens. EFM mount, that tells you the exact mount mechanism that this lens takes. This is an EFM mount camera, not an EF mount camera for the DSLRs, or an EFS mount camera for the other DSLRs. That is very specific per camera. Double check your type of zoom lens or lens mount you have. This is the specific mount. And without going into too much detail, the difference is this lens, the lens actually comes very close to the sensor, whereas in a DSLR, the lens actually ends like a good 4 centimeters from the actual sensor. Now, what else is on here is something very special which most photographers forget to mention. What it says is not only the actual lens type, 15 to 45mm, but the minimum aperture ratios. So you'll see here, one ratio, 1 to 3.5-6.3. That is the minimum ratios for the aperture, which means 0 zoom, so 0. The minimum aperture you can have is 3.5. At maximum zoom, the minimum aperture you can have is 6.3. That is very key to your photography. If you're getting a telephoto lens and the minimum aperture for your telephoto is really cheap and it's like 8.9, that telephoto lens is basically going to be useless unless you have an extremely high ISO on. Now, the aperture, the reason why the aperture changes as minimum as you go zooming in further is basically common sense. In order to adjust the light coming into the camera, you're physically zooming in the actual lens of the camera. However, in order to adjust the light that is coming into the camera, the aperture must shrink because you're actually physically shrinking the area of the object that you're taking in. So that's what zooming in does. You are taking in, you're abstracting the part of the image that you want to take. So that is very key. And then also, this little number brings me on to filters. 49mm. This is the lens diameter that you have, and different lenses will have different lens diameters. Just because your lens takes the same amount does not mean that it's the same diameter. This is a 43mm lens. This is a 49mm lens. I only have a 49mm lens filter with me right now. So, all you do is you get a filter and you rotate it on. Filters are very useful because they apply different effects pre-editing of your image. So this is a polarizer filter, which means it takes in light and it applies a contrast and saturation boost, or decreases the contrast and saturation boost depending on the way you turn it. This is key. For reflections, for this polarizer, you will turn it and the reflections will change, and that is because it is light dependent, which means that the light, depending on which way you turn it, the light will reflect in different ways, and so you will get different results. Now, putting on the camera lens to the body is very simple. You pop it on to the white to white, turn, and click. Getting into camera settings is the fun bit. Turning the camera on. Ta-da. This is the adjustable wheel for me. That is the shutter button. You will see that there is actually an orange light that comes out of my shutter button, and that is because that is the specific light that your camera is recognizing as your focus light. So that is to double check your autofocus. See, if I turn the autofocus off, it doesn't have that light because you're manually focusing. This is to double check the autofocus and to shine light on it. Now, getting into different modes, I will be showing you everything in manual mode. For beginners, I prefer you to stay with aperture priority because you don't have to worry about shutter speed. You just have to worry about the main things like ISO and aperture. Now, getting into this, the shutter speed. The shutter speed is how long you will expose the CMOS sensor inside your camera to light. So as you can see here, 1/500th of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/40th of a second. You know, you can adjust this for whatever you want. This goes down to 1/4000th of a second. Now, for normal photography, do not go any slower than 1/125th of a second unless you have a tripod. It is a fact. You cannot hand shoot anything slower than 1/125th of a second. It is science. Like, it's pointless trying. I've tried it constantly, trying to turn it up a tiny bit. If you're crouching, you can sort of get away with it, but there is still some smoothing on your image. But for this, do not go for anything lower than 1/125th, and openly adjust this per frame. You don't want to just stick with one shutter speed. Be like the camera, adjust it per frame. Every frame is different. Do not attempt to say that, oh yeah, I'm taking this out, I'm going to set the settings up and leave them. Change your settings along the way. Now, that brings us on to the next one. This is the aperture. Now, as I was saying before, there is a little hole at the end of my lens, and that hole is my aperture hole. The aperture is that hole size. So as you can tell, the smaller the hole, the smaller and less light you can let in, but also the smaller the focus ring you have. So you're physically obstructing the focus of your camera lens in order to create a depth of field effect. This is how you get bokeh on a massive level, or like you get like physical subject bokeh, which means you have a subject in focus and then also a bokeh effect behind them. Now, this is slightly different from what you would expect. Aperture, the higher the number, the smaller the ring gets. The lower the number, the bigger the hole gets. For normal photography, stick to the minimum aperture you could possibly have at that zoom level. Don't go changing around the settings unless you are getting properly used to into the settings and getting properly used to into photography, and you have maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks of experience. Do not try to mess with settings that you don't really know how to work or how to experiment with. Now, the ISO, this falls away from the hardware-based adjustments. ISO used to be a hardware adjustment for film cameras. ISO used to be the way in which the speed of the film, that's what it's called. The film would go through the camera and be printed on to, like the CMOS sensor would used to physically print on the image of the whatever you taken onto this actual film. The ISO was the speed at which the film would pass through the actual CMOS sensor. This time it is the image sensitivity to light. This is the per pixel sensitivity to light. I won't bother you with amazingly massive specifics. This is basically how much you amplify the pixels. The reason why you get higher grain values for extremely high ISO values is very simple. You are seeing the pixels, that grain is physically seeing the pixels because there is no smoothing on the pixels, because every pixel has a massive amplification. Now for this, all you need to know is do not go any higher than about 3200. For me, 1600 to 3200 is my sweet spot. 6400 at nighttime, 12,800 for nighttime portraitures. If you want to go with a long shutter speed, 100 is fine. The lower the aperture, the better the overall image will look because the less film grain you get. But also keep in mind, the lower the aperture, the less light sensitivity you will get, which also means if you're shooting light, it will look so much better because you're not getting a blinding flare coming out of your screen. Now, getting into the slightly more advanced settings, we will go into color balance. Color balance is very simple. Neutral tones can vary from about 4800 to about 5500. That is standard normal color tones. Blue tones start around about 4500 and end about 2500. For me, keep the color tone neutral, 5000, 4800, 4900, 5100. Mess around with it in your software. It is a lot easier to do that than it is to do basically set it up every single time you want to take a shot. If you're doing light trails, leave it low. Leave it at about 3,000, 3,500, because it does absolutely piss to try and put that into a, what's it called, a color balance change when you have light trails, because of the way the software works. Now, having a look at more of the settings, you will find your image quality. You have a bunch of these JPEGs. Now, what these JPEGs are a bunch of different types of JPEGs which allow different values of compression. I, on the other hand, use RAW. This camera supports Canon RAW 3, which is the newest version of RAW. You want to stick to RAW unless you're doing nighttime photography, in which case you can get away with JPEGs. But apart from that, stick to RAW. There's literally nothing else to say about that. Single shooting, high speed continuous shooting, low speed continuous shooting, and timers. These are pretty self-explanatory. Low speed continuous is basically my go-to. Timers is my go-to for shooting at nighttime. You know, it's kind of obvious. Autofocus, servo is for moving objects. One shot is for single still lifes. Autofocus method, just leave it at autofocus tracking. 16:9 ratio or 1:1 ratio, depending on if you're posting on Instagram. 16:9 if you're posting on full screen images. Variable light sensitivities, that is adjusting the post exposure. So that is kind of cool. It's kind of hard to explain it. It's basically how the camera automatically recognizes what to set the post exposure to. Picture styles, that is very cool. Just mess around with those, whatever you want. Fine detail is probably what I leave it at. Fairly vivid images with sharp edges, detailed textures, you know. Evaluative metering mode, partial metering, spot metering. Leave it at evaluative metering mode for now. You'll get into all of those metering modes later down the line. It is a little bit annoying to try and swap between the two. I usually go from evaluative to, let's just get this right, evaluative to partial quite a bit, which is kind of annoying when you thought you were in evaluative and you get to partial, you get to evaluative. They don't affect your image entirely, but they do affect it in a way. And to be honest, that is the end of this. I pretty much explained everything. The reason I haven't done the button layout, your button layout will be completely different depending on what camera you have. You'll check out your user manual for the button layouts. The only other thing I can tell you is going into the settings. I will do a full video about settings because there is thousands. However, keep in mind, if you're a photographer, you go to the settings, you want to go to image settings, and when you get to here, color space, you definitely have to choose Adobe RGB. That has a wider color space than sRGB. Just remember that. Now, this is the end of the first video. The second video will be explaining the SX540 and, you know, the general stuff around that. So, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the second one.